Yo, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to a brand new video on the channel. Inside of today's video, I'm going to be giving you guys a tip for all 58 brawlers within the game right now. So also, before we jump into it, make sure you're subscribed if you're not already, because over 64% of you guys are not subscribed to the channel, so you don't miss any future uploads on this channel. So before we jump into it, make sure you're using the create code. That'd be greatly appreciated. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. Okay, so the first one is for Shelly. So Shelly, this one's a little bit of a vague one because you guys know this standard stuff with Shelly. You want to get up close and personal with as many brawlers as possible. But for me, the number one tip has to be to use Band-Aid on Shelly. It's a really underrated star power and can allow you to keep pressure for much longer. And especially if you haven't got a favorable matchup, that Band-Aid healing can really help you out. Okay, so the next tip is for Nita. So for Nita, my number one tip is to not throw your bear into immediate fire. So as you guys know, Nita really sucks right now and Bruce gets taken down really easily. So you want to be putting Bruce in a place that is kind of aggro but behind a wall or something, so at least you can activate a gadget and keep Bruce alive for longer. Okay, next up we have Colt. So the generic kind of tip for him is to always kind of follow the enemy's movement. That's the best way you're going to hit shots with Colt. But for me, the number one tip has to be to break up as much as the map as possible, whether you use gadgets to break open grass points so that people don't sneak up on you with a speed gear, whether you use a super on the grass and to break open walls as well. Just break open as much as possible and it will allow Colt to thrive. So the next tip is for Balls. So Balls' best tip is not only that walls are your best friend, you're going to get a lot of value out of your super if you're constantly behind walls, but also with your super, if you hit the enemy and then get close and personal, hit them twice, you charge your super again. So this is just a quick interaction to note because it allows you to charge your supers really fast, and that's when you make the best plays with Ball. When you're constantly cycling supers, getting a lot of pressure, you're going to make some amazing plays. So next up we have Jesse. So Jesse, this might not seem like an actual pro tip, but trust me, a lot of people actually don't do this with Jesse. So for me, I like to use Jesse as a shotgunner a lot of the times because she does actually do a lot of damage, nearly 5k damage with 3 shots. So don't be afraid to sneak up, just run into the enemies, spam auto aim, get them down really quick because she's surprisingly a good shotgunner. So the same kind of tip applies with Brock, because with 3 pieces of ammo you can deal 5,200 damage, which is pretty insane, and this kind of strategy gets me a long way with Brock. Trust me, he's a sharpshooter. You guys are probably looking for some long range kind of tips, but honestly, using him as a shotgunner sometimes can be really unexpected to the enemies and you deal a lot of damage. And another quick tip is that his shots actually shoot through walls, so if there's any type of spawners or turrets behind a wall, your normal main attack can actually take that down. So the next tip is for Dynamite. For me, the number one tip is to never auto aim with him unless the enemy is stunned or slowed. You can get quick attacks off if they are stunned or slowed, but just in normal attacks you don't want to auto aim ever. You're going to miss basically every single shot. And then another quick tip is that for the most part, I don't know if it's just me, but whenever I play Dynamite, sometimes I like to juke the enemies out a little bit. If it's say an enemy down the left hand side, I'll just shoot a main attack at them down the left, and say if there's an enemy down the right, I'll just throw my super out pretty much instantly. Basically all of the time I hit my super doing this. I don't know why, but it seems to work. So the next tip is for Bo, and mainly around his super totem. I feel like a lot of people play his totem wrong, and this is the best 3 ways to use it. So for me, the number one way to use it is when you're either healing or there's not a lot of action going on. You can just simply just sit in your totem, charge your super a little bit, as long as the enemies aren't pressuring you up. You can use your totem if you're really close to super as well. A lot of times you can just throw it out. If you're a couple of ticks away from your mines, it's really worth just using that gadget. And then the third way is to tank an enemy's shot. Say if it's like an aggressive Leon, or there's like a B with a 3k, that totem gadget can be really good just to tank. I know it's only got 1k HP, but trust me, it can come clutch sometimes. So next up we have Tick. So the number one tip for him has to be to kind of aim your knockback towards some attacks. So for me, whenever a brawler kind of charges into you, I'm normally shooting like a couple of attacks in front of me or on top of me, and I'm making sure that I'm aiming my gadget towards them. So I'm aiming that knockback towards those shots. So for the most part, you want to be actually behind the enemy, knock them forward into your main attacks. So the next tip is for 8-bit. So the 8-bit one is fairly simple. 8-bit really revolves heavily around his turret. So it's all about cycling his turret. So if you're using a plugged in star power, you're going to put that turret as safe as possible because you want to be getting that speed boost as much as possible. And if you're using the boosted booster star power, you want to be putting it somewhere where you and your teammates can get a lot of advantage from it. So next up we have Ems. So the number one tip for Ems is to always try to connect your super onto as many enemies as possible. That slow is so crippling, especially if you got the hype star power as well. You you're going to be getting so much value. But basically just try and ride the walls as much as possible, because there's nothing more threatening than an Ems with a super behind a wall. You really can't do anything to get that Ems out. Okay, so next up we have Stu. So for Stu, auto aim is your best friend, especially when it comes down to supers. So if you didn't know already, whichever direction you're facing, if you just auto aim your super, you'll be super in that way. And especially if you want to chain shots a lot really quickly with Stu, just literally spamming that auto aim button on the super is going to allow you just to ping across the map a lot quicker. So that's kind of how I play Stu. Not really the best, but it does allow you to chain supers quite well. So next up we have El Primo. So El Primo is incredibly trash in the meta. So many different brawlers can counter him. So for me, it has to be prioritizing and getting that first super. So whether that's you just go in, take as much damage as possible, try not to die, but you want to be taking a lot of damage because that super is so hard to get. You want to get that first super as quickly as possible, cycle as much as possible, and you should be somewhat okay with Primo. So the next pro tip is for Barley. So for Barley, whenever I'm playing down a lane, I tend to conserve a lot of shots. By that, I mean, don't just completely waste all 3 of your ammo straight away. It's going to be really easy for the enemy to gain pressure on you. You want to at least conserve a couple of shots, or at least one, because you can at least zone people out. For the most part, I'll be shooting like one shot, maybe a little bit up to them. If I miss that, shoot it a little bit to the left or right. You get what I mean. You try and force enemies into a little bit of a position, so it's a bit easier for you to hit shots. So the next tip is for Poco. So the main tip for Poco for me has to be to try and get as much value as possible out of your main attack. Try and chain your super really quickly, whether that's so you have to position yourself to hit multiple enemies with one piece of ammo. This will really help to keep you and your teammates alive, and it will just allow you to get a lot of pressure. So the next tip is for Rosa. So for Rosa, for me, to make good use out of her is whenever you're close to super, make sure you're in a really aggro position close to the enemy. It doesn't matter if you're really weak, you want to be pushing as much as possible, because once you pop that super, there's hardly any brawlers in the game that can take you down. So make sure you're getting that kind of surprise factor with Rosa. So next up we have a tip for Rico. So the tip for Rico has to be try and line up your super with as many people as possible, but also when you're getting close to your super, just imagine kind of the scenarios that you could use it in and use it as quickly as possible. So as soon as you get that super, try and get the value out of it to surprise the enemies and just absolutely melt. Okay, so the next tip is for Daryl. So this one's a bit centered towards Brawl, and it's always trying to catch the enemies off guard and get in some good surprise elements with his super. So always look at where the ball is, position yourself really well with a super, and a lot of the times you could maybe get like a sneak goal, especially if the enemies are really unaware. And then also just a generic tip in general is to always aim your super to land directly on top of the enemies, so you can get that knockback and finish off kills a little bit easier. So next up we have Penny. So good Penny player will always put their first turret far back, so then they can cycle their turret much better. Once you get a little bit of control, once you know you're going to be able to cycle your turret again pretty quickly, then you can start putting your turret a little bit higher once you get a lot of pressure, or if the enemies are weak. But trust me, you don't want to be wasting that first turret, because it can still take a little bit of a while to get it. So the next tip is for Carl. So for Carl, the number one tip has to be to always shoot your main attack before you super in, especially if the enemies are far away. It's going to allow you to get that additional damage, but also recharge your super a little bit quicker, and just overall increases your DPS. So next up we have Jackie. Jackie is pretty useless within this meta, but a good Jackie player will always use walls to their advantage, using their presence to at least get a little bit of pressure on the map and get some map positioning. But for most part, if you're going in with Jackie, you're probably going to get melted pretty quickly. So just try and get as much damage as possible, so then your teammates can come and clean up. So next up we have a tip with Piper, and this is regarding her homemade recipe gadgets. So for Piper, especially when you get into the range of 2-tapping a brawler, so whether this be like an enemy sharpshooter as well, when they're below like say 4k HP, if you get one tap in, you can quickly auto aim the gadget, and for the most part you're going to be able to finish off the kill really quickly. And especially if the enemy set for say has like a counter to that gadget, like another gadget of their own, like a jump or something, you're going to be really quick, and a lot of times this will be a successful double tap. Okay, so next up we have a tip with Pam. So for Pam, it all relies around her super. So with a super, you want to keep it alive for as long as possible. Try and put the turret behind a wall so you can keep it alive, as I said, but also with that star power, getting the 800 damage per tick, it's going to be really strong, especially when you're pushing an enemy when they're really weak. A lot of times you can just get the kill with a super, but also use the super to tank a lot of shots. It has over 4k HP, so you can definitely use it to body block you a lot. So next up, a tip for Frank. So for me, it's to try to preserve your super for as long as needed. By that, I mean whenever you get your super, don't just throw it out straight away. You want to try and preserve it, use it as pressure, especially with the amount of HP you have with Frank. you could definitely take a long time just to keep the enemies back, wait for your teammates to push up, and then use that super. So next up we have BB. So for BB, it's to try and get a double hit with your bubble as much as possible. So by this, I mean whenever you have your knockback and your super, basically when you knock back the enemies, straight away you want to auto aim that super, and for the most part, if you perfect this right, you can get 2 hits with your bubble, so you can charge your super back a lot quicker, deal a lot more damage. It's just a win-win. So next up we have B. So for B, it's all down to her super. So for me, it's to try and practice as best as possible on landing those B supers. She's going to really thrive the more you charge your super, the more you connect onto enemies with, because it's going to be so easy just to constantly charge your 3k onto them over and over again. So get practicing, especially with the curves. So next up we have Nanny. So the main tip with Nanny is to always undershoot your shot or overshoot it. By that I mean, especially because of how Nanny can get a little bit of an additional range by the end of her shots, sometimes it's really hard to get like that 3k shot onto them and get their full potential damage. So a lot of times you just want to undershoot the shot so you can at least get a little bit of trickle damage, and especially you can overshoot it as well at max range, just because the enemies might change their movement patterns, so make sure you're kind of switching up the way you shoot with Nanny. Okay, so the next tip is for Edgar. So for Edgar is really useless without his super. So for me, you have to really stress not wasting that super. It takes so long to get it back, especially if you're not using the Let's Fly gadget, and you want to be making sure that you're assessing the situation every single time, kind of like Mortis. You're counting down the ammo, making sure that you can survive if you jump in, and cycle it efficiently. So the next tip is for Griff, and this one is a little bit of an underrated slash sneaky tip. So for me, this second star power, Business Resilience, is actually a really underrated star power. All pros are using it right now because it allows you to sustain pressure a little bit easier. You can keep on shooting whilst healing up, which is pretty cool. And for the most part, it's actually the better star power for Grom. The next tip is for Grom. So for Grom, it all relies around his super. It's probably the best thing about him. And a quick tip is to quickly shoot just before or just after you actually throw out your super. It's going to be near impossible for the enemies to dodge that shot, so it just gives you that additional bit of damage, allowing you to deal up to 4k damage plus. So next up we have Bonnie. So the number one tip for Bonnie has to be unpredictable with your supers. So for me, you have to make sure you go in even on the inconvenient matchups, because Bonnie is just so OP right now. Even if it's like a Primo with super, jumping onto them, you could probably get a lot of damage onto them, and the enemies might not expect it. So the surprise factor is always the best thing about Bonnie. Pretty much every matchup is good for her. So next up we have a tip from the best Mortis player in the world. So for me, it's always assessing who you can super and chain against before you actually go in, because the best thing about Mortis is by far his super, and if you waste it, it's going to take a long time to then gain it again. Just take around, I think, 5 dashes to actually get the first one. So you want to be making sure that you're chaining your super against multiple enemies to efficiently destroy them. Okay, so next up we have a tip for Tara. So good Tara players will always try and get extra value out of that super. So by that I mean by either double pulling, triple pulling, or breaking up walls within your super, but also pulling their enemies. So especially in maps world gamers like Brawl, you can efficiently break open the goal, but whilst also still pulling the enemy. So by that, you want to aim your super right in the middle where the wall is, so then you can break it open, but as I said, still pulling the enemies, and you should be able to get some cool goals with that. So next up we have a tip for Jean. So for Jean is, don't be afraid to use your knockback even when you pull an opponent. Sometimes it can give you that extra bit of time to finish off the opponent or make them weak. So there's always that type of range where you want to look before you pull to see if you can finish off the enemies. Normally up close, you want to make sure that the opponents are below 1400 HP. Around mid range, so around 2800 HP, you can pull them and finish them off with 2 shots. At long range, you could probably even get 4 shots on the opponent if you move back whilst pulling, and then maybe even also knocking back the opponent. You can deal up to nearly 6k damage with Jean, so just make sure you're judging and making sure that you've got enough ammo to finish off a kill. So next up it is Max. So for Max, a fairly simple one, but a lot of people go wrong whenever they're playing Max, but for me it's to always use your super with as many teammates as possible. So you want to be using your super when you can gather all of your teammates together, because then all 3 of you as a unit can push up, get control of the map, and get a lot of pressure. So next up we have Mr. P. So for Mr. P, the number one tip has to be to always put your super far back when you get that first one. So just like Penny, it is vital that you always try and have that turret or spawner up, just because they heavily rely out of that spawner. So for Mr. P, you want to put it further back, so then you can allow the porter to scout, waste their enemy ammo, and then cycle your super back even better. So next up we have some tips for Sprout. So there's 2 that I feel are essential whenever you're trying to play Sprout. So the first one is to try and use walls to your advantage as much as possible. By that I mean with your main attack, so you can increase its range, but also just increase its radius so that the enemies are more likely to walk towards that shot and hit them, so it can be really nice to bounce it off a wall and just cover more distance. And then also with your super alone, make sure you're trying to cover as much area as possible. So there's certain maps in the game where they have like a sweet spot where the super will just cover a large amount of area. You always want to try and aim your super so it just covers a lot of area, so then you can make sure you're funneling the opponents efficiently. Okay, so next up we have Byron. So the number one tip for Byron, which a lot of people still don't seem to know, is to auto aim your super with Byron. Literally 95% of the time it is better to auto aim your super with Byron. To begin with, I wasn't really a firm believer of this, and then I started switching to auto aim my supers and I hit a lot more. Of course, there'll be some scenarios where just manually aiming is probably a little bit better, especially if they're within a bush, but for the most part you just want to auto aim that super, get it out straight away, and you're going to be hitting those opponents much easier. Okay, so next up we have Squeak. So just because of his main attack mechanics, you want to be trying to force the enemies into uncomfortable position. So this is all about zoning the enemies, so you don't really want to be spamming the ammo on the same spot over and over again, unless of course they're literally in your face. So making sure you're scattering the shots, by that I mean is to push forward with your shots. So if your shot is obviously in a little bit of a medium position, make sure you're actually shooting your next shot further and closer to the enemy. Don't just put it all in one position. So next up we have a tip for Spike. So for Spike, whenever you're playing competitive, for the most part, when you have curveball, you're going to be playing down the left hand lane. The main reason for this is because the curveball shots curve towards the right, so if an enemy is behind the wall, it's a lot easier to hit the enemy if you're on the left side of the map, because obviously the way it curves, rather than on the right side of the map, because if you hit them, you're trying to hit them behind the wall, and if you're shooting on the far right side, you're not really going to bend around that wall, but if you're on the far left side, you're going to be able to hit a lot more shots. Okay, so next up we have Crow. So people really overvalue staying alive with Crow. A lot of times if I have my super, I want to be using it as quickly as possible, and brawlers below around 4k HP, because even if you're not finishing off the brawlers, a lot of times you can get a lot of damage. It's going to allow your teammates to push up even if you die, and even sometimes when you land, you can pop your gadget. If you land near multiple enemies, you're going to get so much value out of slowing the enemies and just getting a lot of pressure with that jump. Okay, so next up we have Leon. So with the introduction of vision gear into the meta, it's even harder to be unpredictable with Leon right now, so even more so you want to be as evasive as possible. Make sure you're really unpredictable every single time, but with Leon, a good Leon player will always be really aggressive. Make sure you're sustaining that evasiveness. Okay, so next up we have a tip for Sandy. So for Sandy, it's all about his super, so you want to be making sure that you're not wasting his super, but especially making sure that with your super you're connecting the grass tiles with the super and also walls as well. The main reason for this is because it's a lot harder to predict where you are within the super if you're actually connecting it to grass tiles, because they won't see you if you enter the grass within your super, so it just makes it a little bit harder for the enemies to predict you. Okay, so next up we have a tip for Amber. So for Amber, the number one tip is to always auto aim, literally in every single position except for when they're in grass. Just auto aim. It's literally a spray and pray brawler. Auto aim is going to be your best friend here. That is by far the number one tip. Okay, so next up we have a tip for Meg. So the number one tip for Meg has to be within her mech stage. You're going to be making sure that you're trying to push close to a wall if you're close to a super within a mech stage. So if you're close to that swipe, you want to make sure you're kind of hugging the wall, because enemies are going to find it really hard to push into you, and for the most part, especially if you have the damage gear activated, you're going to deal up to 4k damage, which is absolutely insane. Enemies are going to have to just run into you and take that damage. A lot of brawlers you can basically one shot with this technique. Okay, so next up we have Gale. So for Gale, it's all about his super and positioning yourself so you're in a really good situation close to a wall, but more so you want to make sure you're using your super for pressure, because not a lot of enemies can kind of counteract that Gale stun. It's super powerful, especially when there's walls around you, so make sure you're using your super a lot of the time just for presence alone. Okay, so for Surge, you want to be making sure that whenever you're about to use your super, you want to try and be close to an enemy and hit them with your main attack and then super straight away. What this allows you to do is cycle your super a lot quicker. You're going to be able to get a third to your next super if you can quickly shoot and then super. It's really efficient if you actually manage to work this mechanic out pretty quickly. You're going to be cycling supers with Surge in no time, and of course getting your levels up a lot quicker. So next up we have Colette. So for Colette, my number one tip is to always try and super an enemy when they're close to a wall. The main reason for this is because you'll be hitting the enemy, hitting a wall and just returning a lot quicker than whether they're in the open. It's going to take a long time to actually shoot forward and then shoot all the way back. Gives you a lot of time, well, a lot quicker time to get back. recharge your super again with 2 more hits, and then keep going and cycling that super. So next up we have Lou. So Lou is a brawler that heavily depends on his super and whether you're getting a lot of value with it. So for me, whenever I've got gadgets available, I'm making sure that I'm just throwing my super straight on top of their enemies, popping their gadget, making sure that they're half the way frozen, and it's going to effectively allow you to cycle your supers really quickly and actually be able to finish off your opponents much easier. Okay, so next up we have Ruffs. So Ruffs, there's a few tips that I want to tell you guys about him because I feel like a lot of people get this brawler wrong. So the first one is to basically never throw your super forward, because for the most part you're going to be wasting that power up. They're really important to get your whole team powered up, unless you're about to like score. Maybe you throw the super to break open the walls so you can score in Brawl. There's never really a good chance to throw your super high up, because again, you don't want to waste that super whatsoever. Then also, depending on the team composition, you want to be giving the power-ups first to your high HP brawlers. The main reason you want to do this is because they're going to get a bigger increase in HP when they get the super. So make sure you're following these tips with Ruffs. So next up we have a tip for Belle, and it's to do with her second gadget, reverse polarity. So this gadget is insanely underrated and especially strong on really defensive maps. So what this allows you to do, essentially, if you get your shot in a good bounce position, if you hit the opponent, it's going to allow you to get that more pressure. If you hit that shot to begin with and then it starts bouncing upon your opponents, you can then stop to push up the map that bit quicker, whilst in comparison the other gadget is a little bit more defensive. So if you want to be a bit more aggressive, definitely use this gadget. Okay, so next up we have a tip for Buzz. So whenever I'm playing Buzz, I'm trying to stay behind a wall as much as possible until I have my stun. But when you're trying to charge up that stun, of course you want to be going closer to as many opponents as possible, because this is going to effectively allow you to charge your super a lot quicker. But with Buzz, he really does suck without his stuns, so just heavily dependent on cycling those stuns as much as possible. Okay, so next up we have Ash. So just a quick tip with Ash. So for me, whenever I've got my super available, and if you're using the chill pill gadget, effectively, if you know you're about to hit an opponent with those rats, if you know for sure that it's a good matchup and they're going to connect onto them, make sure you're popping that gadget first to get that additional healing, and then your rats are going to be able to hit the opponent and cycle your rage up much quicker. So effectively, you're going to be getting a lot of value out of it. So next up we have Lola. So for Lola, the key for her to get a lot of value in the game is to get a lot of value out of her freeze frame gadget. You want to play around that gadget as much as possible. Try and stay behind that clone. Let it tank a lot. You're going to get a lot of pressure with it. It's going to take so long for the enemies to get it down, and you can of course get a lot of damage with it. So making sure you're getting so much value out of her gadget. Okay, so next up we have Fang. So Fang's playstyle has switched a lot since his nerf. You're not able just to spam super and just fly across the map as much as possible. Now you have to kind of center your supers around that one individual matchup. You want to go against the strongest brawler you counters. So for most part, it's going to be those brawlers with no knockbacks and below around 4,500 HP, because then you can just super onto them and most likely just hit them with one attack and finish them off really quickly. You don't want to be in a position where you're just bouncing around the map and not really doing much damage to the opponents. Okay, so next up we have Eve. So Eve is a pretty self-explanatory one, which really isn't like a pro tip, but for me it's to always just abuse her mechanics as much as possible. By that I mean just try and use the water as much to your advantage, because people still get bamboozled by this. A lot of times it can be awkward to shoot Eve across the water, so just making sure you're using the water as much as possible. Okay, so next up we have Janet. So especially in the initial stages, don't be afraid to use 1 or 2 gadgets in quick succession to get really high pressure on their enemies. So by that I mean don't be afraid just to burn them really early on. Some people like to hold on to this gadget for far too long. Sometimes I just like spamming them out really quickly, because you can constantly stop the regen of the enemy. It's super frustrating to face against, so I know for sure that doing this to your opponents is really going to allow you to get so much pressure and get those early gameplays. Okay, and finally we have a tip for Otis. So my number 1 tip for Otis is a lot of people get this brawler wrong when they're trying to super opponent from really far away. A lot of times that opponent, if they're supered, can just hide, run up behind a wall, and you're not going to be able to get close enough to even get really any damage to them. So making sure that using that super up close, so then you can take them down much easier and efficiently. Alright guys, it's going to be it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed this one. Let me know whether you like these type of videos, and I'll continue to pump out this type of content, especially when it comes down to these pro tips. I can go a lot more in depth if you guys want me to. I kind of want to keep it a little bit simpler just to see if you guys like it. So that's going to be it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.